Good afternoon, everyone. Shalom. I'm Shosh Bedrosian from the National Public Diplomacy Directorate, and today is the first day of Hanukkah. I'll be taking a few questions after a couple of brief points to share with you today. Just make sure you put your questions in the chat of this Zoom with your name and your outlet. Thanks. Israelis were shocked and horrified over the egregious terror attack that rocked the Jewish community in Bondi Beach, Australia, on Sunday. Jews were hunted down. They were murdered for one simple reason: because they were Jewish. A phenomenon, an epidemic, Prime Minister Netanyahu has been warning leaders around the world of for months, including Prime Minister Albanese, which has tragically fallen on deaf ears. Prime Minister Netanyahu said that the Albanese government's lack of action, their weakness and appeasement have led to the cold blood murder of a rabbi, a child, a Holocaust survivor, just to name a few, who were celebrating the first night of Hanukkah on the beach in Sydney. Since Hamas's genocidal attack on the Jews of Israel on Simchat Torah on October 7th, there have been horrific terror attacks in Berlin and Munich in Germany, and Tokyo, Japan, Montreal, Canada, in Russia, Warsaw, Poland, many in France, many attacks in the Melbourne and Sydney, Australia communities. In Washington, D.C. in the United States, 2 Israeli embassy staffers killed by a gunman who shouted "Free Palestine." 2 Jews in Manchester murdered on Yom Kippur. And now, it is the open field killing on the Jews of Bondi Beach on the first night of Hanukkah. Attacks on Jews abroad and attacks on Jews here in Israel. All of it enabled by too many world leaders who appease support for terror in their countries, with no real actions to defend their Jewish communities, except advice for their Jews to simply stay home. All the while, Hamas and jihad supporters, they march freely on their streets, in their cities. Anti-Semitism has reached an all-time high in Australia, and the Jewish community there has been under attack and at its peak after October 7th. 4 months ago, on August 17th, Prime Minister Netanyahu sent a letter directly to Prime Minister Albanese, warning him of the alarming rise of anti-Semitism in Australia and the lack of decisive action from his government to confront it. Prime Minister Netanyahu stated in that letter that since the Australian government's decision to recognize a Palestinian state, Australian cities have faced an intensified campaign of anti-Semitism. Albanese's call for a Palestinian state pours fuel on the anti-Semitic fire, with Prime Minister Netanyahu making it clear that this decision is not diplomacy. It is simply appeasement, and is a reward for Hamas's terror against the Jewish people. Australia's historically high levels of anti-Semitism has not only led to Jews being murdered on the first night of Hanukkah, but in the last year, vandals defaced a historic Melbourne synagogue with graffiti praising Iran and calling to free Palestine. Arsonists targeted the East Melbourne Hebrew congregation during a Shabbat dinner, and masked rioters stormed an Israeli-owned restaurant in central Melbourne, shouting "Death to the IDF." Tragically, it may be more apparent to officials around the world right now what calling to globalize the Intifada really means: to exterminate the Jewish people, slaughter them, and wipe out the state of Israel, the only Jewish state in the world, off the map. Prime Minister Netanyahu further shared with Albanese in that letter that anti-Semitism is a cancer, and it spreads when leaders stay silent. It retreats when leaders act. Prime Minister Netanyahu made it very clear to his message to Albanese on Sunday: your government did nothing to stop the spread of anti-Semitism in Australia. You did nothing to curb the cancer cells that were growing inside of your country. You took no action, and instead, you let a disease spread so quickly, at least 15 Jews were murdered in your Sydney community. We've heard media outlets also far too long, for 2 years now, also try to explain that protests calling to, quote, globalize the Intifada were simply protesting the Israeli government's war in Gaza. Let me put this on the record. There is no distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. To be a Jew is to be tied to this land. You cannot take a Jew out of the land of Judea. And the media's complacency and inability to educate its viewers and readers on the facts of these protests has led to the further incitement on the streets of cities around the world. Mainstream media has amplified the voices of terror who have perpetuated violence against the Jewish community, not just verbally, but physically. Today's journalism has not called out what we see on the streets, what we've seen on the streets since October 7th. Rather, they've watered it down. They've watered down the real message behind these protesters' words. 18 hours after our Jewish community was massacred in Sydney, a violent protest erupted outside a concert hall in Amsterdam for a Hanukkah celebration, with some protesters in the crowd calling to, quote, kill the Jews. This is simply not about Israel, but the Jewish people and the obsession pro-Hamas supporters to end the Jewish people and the state of Israel. Unfortunately for them, their vicious anti-Semitic campaign has only further proved why the Jewish state is essential to this world, and we will fight back. We mourn our Jewish brothers and sisters who were viciously taken from us, including the Chabad rabbi of Bondi, who worked to spread Jewish light to his community and touch lives right here in Israel. This act of terror could have been prevented if these threats of anti-Semitism were simply taken seriously. May their memories, all their memories of these victims, be a blessing, and those who are currently recovering, may it be a swift and easy recovery. I also want to remind you, today is day 801 since Hamas launched its horrific attack on our country, massacring our people. Our hero and final hostage is still in Gaza, that is Ron Gvili. Prime Minister Netanyahu is working to return the remains of Ron Gvili to his family, and he is exhausting all efforts in Gaza and in Cairo to ensure he is returned. The Prime Minister also lit candles with Ron's family for the first night of Hanukkah yesterday. And next, I can share with you Prime Minister Netanyahu. He met with U.S. Ambassador to Turkey and Special Envoy for Syria, Tom Barrack, here today in Jerusalem. I can tell you they had a close and a productive meeting, as you would expect from Israel's greatest ally. I'll now take a few questions. Okay, first question from Or Shaked. Israel Hayom, would you be able to share some information about the meeting that took place between Prime Minister Netanyahu and U.S. Envoy Tom Barrack, especially in light of recent comments about Israel? What I can share with you is exactly what I just said in the briefing, or it was a very close and productive conversation between the two of them. Okay. Stephen Shear from Reuters. Did Israel specifically ask for stepped-up security around this time in Australia and in other countries for Hanukkah? On the topic of Australia specifically, of course, I'm not going to go into Israel's intelligence and internal conversations about this, but Prime Minister Albanese was warned by Prime Minister Netanyahu in a letter. I mentioned that in the briefing. Not only was he warned through a letter, but his streets were filled with Jew hatred since October 7th. His streets were the massive warning. After Hamas's massacre on October 7th, pro-Hamas extremists and left-wing radicals began a campaign to intimidate, to vandalize, and attack Jews across the free world. Prime Minister Netanyahu wrote in that letter specifically in Australia. The campaign intensified under Albanese's watch. These are not isolated incidents. This is an epidemic. From Hannah Julian, the Jewish edition, did the Prime Minister and Ambassador Barrack discuss the issue of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad? What I can share with you on that, Hannah, is what I was just able to about that meeting that took place today. This is a reporter from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Police forces in Canada's largest cities, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, say they are stepping up security for Jewish communities in the wake of the deadly shooting. What do you make of this? And if I may ask a second question, do you have a comment on 6 Canadian members of Parliament intending to visit Jerusalem and the West Bank, Judea, and Samaria starting tomorrow? I don't have any information to share with you on that right now. I just will mention this horrific attack that took place yesterday. To see our fellow Jews inside of this community speaking even on camera with blood all over their faces, blood on their hands. These were horrific sights to see from our Jewish community there that was massacred in broad daylight. These people were simply trying to joyfully celebrate the first night of Hanukkah. And I mentioned all of this inside of our briefing as well. I want to reiterate that Prime Minister Netanyahu on August 17th, 2025, he called on Albanese in the letter I referenced to replace weakness with action, appeasement with resolve, and to do so by the Jewish New Year. Well, instead, 4 months later, right now, here's the result. More than 15 Jews, they were murdered in cold blood. Deaths that could have been prevented if actions were taken to dispel the pro-Hamas protests, to understand and learn the truth behind what globalized the Intifada really means, and to open your eyes and confront the Hamas and Hezbollah flags on your streets, in your cities. Instead, Australian authorities, they told Jews to actually stay at home to allow these disgraceful mobs to take over the streets, take over their cities, calling for the genocide of the Jews. Yet officials, they turned a blind eye to their words and they sat back when they acted. Appeasement never moderates radicals, and it radicalizes the streets. In fact, it starts on the streets where these horrific protests we've seen over the last 2 years have taken place. Okay. Looks like those are the questions that we have right now. You can reach out to our office if you have additional questions. Thank you so much for everyone for joining us today.